G'day, HM Hart here again. And in this video I'm going to talk about repetition compulsion in borderline personality disorder. And what exactly does that mean? So put simply, a repetition, I'm just using my own notes here. Put simply, repetition compulsion, well, this is a quote, this part, okay, is a psychological phenomenon in which a person repeats traumatic events, or a traumatic event or many, or its circumstances over and over again. And so this includes reenacting the event or putting oneself in situations where the event is. But in borderline personality disorder, it has a lot more to do with the reenactment of trauma, the reenactment of perceived or actual abandonment and or attachment trauma. What arrests emotional development for those who go on to be diagnosed with BPD at the age of 2. So a repetition compulsion is the reenactment of trauma, and in borderline personality disorder, it is of a highly dissociative nature, and often, usually, unless someone gets enough therapy to start understanding this, who has BPD, and working through it, it's very much subconscious. So it's not the targeted looking thing to get you, a la the way narcissists do things, that people so think it is from people with borderline personality disorder. But nonetheless, those who are close to somebody with BPD reenacting trauma and repetition compulsions and being triggered to emotional dysregulation and then acting in ways that are highly conflictual, raging, or acting out in other ways that are abusive to others, and sometimes over the course of time traumatic to others. There's no excusing that reality or that fact. So basically any reenactment of the trauma, or traumas plural, is 75% of people with BPD. The self, kind of in air quotes, the self, or borderline false self may play the role of either victim or victimizer, or alternate back and forth between the two in any given repetition compulsion or high conflict situation where they have been triggered into emotional dysregulation in a dissociative episode that is a reenactment of something from their core trauma and from the past. It gets just thrown into the here and now via not only being triggered and the intensity of the emotion, but also because they are it's dissociative in nature, and they are actually then, through the defense mechanism of splitting, seeing the person. It could be a partner, it could be an adult child, it could be the parent, whoever has BPD, they then see that other person, unbeknownst to themselves, as, like I said in my last video, really, the split bad other representation of the wounding parent or parents. So they're not even putting all this out at you in the here and now, but it seems like that, right? And you're still bearing the brunt of it, like I said in my last video. So it's important for loved ones, non-personality disorder people, non-borderline, so to speak, in all types of relationships, to understand that when a borderline is triggered into this repetition compulsion, reenactment of trauma, it's really aimed at you just sitting there as an object other representation of a wounding parent in that defense mechanism of splitting. But yet you are the one who's going like, what's going on here? Or maybe you get reactive back. It's like, but I didn't do that. I didn't do. And so there's a lot going on there on both sides, right? And then, so also with repetition compulsion, the reenactment of trauma, and those with BPD, there's social attachment, and there's like the trauma response has a lot to do with attachment and or interrupted or insecure or no attachment and no bond, as was the case with myself when I had BPD I recovered in 1995, but there was no bond with my mother or I. And that is very traumatic for a child because it's about safety, beyond safety needs, this bond, this that when it goes well enough, shall we say, or right with a parent, a mother, and a child is critical to whether or not a child is going to be able to continue to develop healthily through the stages of development, early childhood development, or get arrested emotional development. And that's what happens with people who go on to be diagnosed with BPD. But it really happens by the age of 2, and then it's just compounded, and a whole lot of things happen over those years. So, and this is what's being recapitulated, if you will, in the reenactment of this trauma. So, human beings are strongly dependent on social support, obviously, and especially infants. I mean, that's survival right there, whether or not mother or someone, caregiver, whoever it is, comes consistently and meets needs that are survival, biological survival needs, even as much as they are also very much, they are very integral to psychological growth and actual psychological survival of a self that continues to grow versus the psychological death that occurs to abandonment or attachment trauma in those who go on to be diagnosed with BPD because of that. Well, it's really a sort of a cutoff of the infant or the preverbal precognitive very young human being feeling like it's unsurvivable. It's the threat to survival. It just is so wounding and damaging. So yeah, this is, I mean, this sense of connectedness, this bond that's so important, this attachment, provides that sense of not only that you're going to be okay and you're safe and you're surviving, but it has meaning, power, and control. So it is about biological maturation. These early attachment bonds, whether or not they succeed, become trauma bonds, no bonds, interrupted bonds, insecure bonds. The traumatization occurs when both internal and external resources are inadequate to cope with external threats. And so when there's misattunement, when there's abuse, when there's lack of attachment, interrupted attachment, no bonding, or any sense of abandonment, then that exceeds the resources of an infant or young child to cope with this external threat, which it causes the primal woundedness in borderlines that results in unresolved subconsciously this trauma that's continually cyclically reenacted. And I think I got this quote from probably it's Wikipedia, but it just popped up in a search. This is a quote. So, quote, Freud thought that the aim of repetition was to gain mastery, but clinical experience has shown that this rarely happens. Instead, repetition causes further suffering for the victims or for people in their surroundings, unquote, which is absolutely true. So in life, in these subconscious reenactments of repetition compulsions, the relational attempts that trigger borderlines into these repetition compulsions by the triggered dissociative splitting nature and defense mechanisms that come up as a result of just trying to be close, because that involves attachment and brings to the surface a tremendous fear of abandonment. They don't help to resolve or repair this either perceived or actual abandonment or any attachment trauma. And so that doesn't really happen in all this cyclical, ways in which often people with BPD cycle through the trigger, the emotional dysregulation, the reenactment of trauma, what is called a repetition compulsion. But I've really noticed, and it's almost about 24 years or so now that I've been working with people with BPD as well as loved ones, and people have been abused by those with NPD, etc. Many different kinds of people with different kinds of issues. But when I the approach that I take in working with people with borderline personality disorder as clients is that these reenactments can be very helpful to gaining understanding and getting to what really everything, all the repetition compulsions are about, but also reframing experience. So in helping clients to start to open to the actual awareness and, like I said, understanding of what is being reenacted and why, and that it is being reenacted, and that there's a difference between, the intellectual part of sort of not knowing self that's in the here and now, and what happens emotionally, where this dissociative thing happens when they're triggered, where they're in the past, and the past gets pulled into the now, and it's really hard on those around those with BPD, abusive and traumatizing at times, and no excuse for that abuse, but it's not being done to on purpose. Very rarely anyway, if ever. So I'm often asked why repetition is important. When trying to make a significant change in life, repetition in general, or repetition compulsions, reenactment of trauma. And to understand the answer to that question, one must be aware of what it is that one is really trying to change with that experience that keeps happening, that they may have no control over or conscious awareness of. And so therein lies the core reason why repetition compulsions, reenacted borderline trauma, resolves nothing in interpersonal relationships, and, like I said, often abuses and traumatizes and drives other people away, and people with BPD are being very abusive while this is occurring, while they're in the active throes of these triggered, dysregulated, emotional, dissociative episodes of reenacting trauma, but they don't know that usually. So they have no way to understand that what you're experiencing on the other side of that, no excuse for abuse still, or trauma, but they also don't tend to they can't take responsibility for it. They don't understand. And I'm not making excuses. That's just the way it is for them. And then there's how it is for you. And yes, you have to respect yourself enough to um, to ensure that you have a boundary that requires this person with BPD in your life to get into treatment to resolve this, or you can't keep taking the pounding that's not even directed at you, because you become invisible during the repetition compulsion reenactment of trauma, and you are the split off, bad, object other, wounding parent representation. So you're taking all this abuse, and it's not intended abuse, but you're taking all what becomes abuse around somebody with BPD who's reenacting trauma through repetition compulsions, and it's not even aimed at you, but you're there. So it's really important for people who are on the other side of people with BPD to understand what that really means and what's happening. You're not seen, you're not considered, you're not there, you're not even real in that moment, because you are the object other, the bad, split off object other, representation of the wounding parent. And yet, so you're like, what's going on here? That's what's going on, and it doesn't have anything to do with you, but you are there, and so it's directed at you. And so anyway, the just getting back to the heart of this video, because I want to try to keep them shorter a lot. So this doesn't work. This reenacting the trauma, the repetition compulsions do not resolve anything, and they hurt other people, and they cause people with BPD to suffer more, to feel humiliated, to feel shame, to not know why they've done whatever they've done, whatever you're talking about. They may get part of it, they may not get most of it, they may not remember it accurately, they may then project out and defend themselves and say you did it all. And so, but the difference is that so these cyclical reenactments are a central aspect of change, or the opportunity that awaits each person with BPD for change, for those, with BPD, sorry. And for example, just as an example, in the eclectic modalities I incorporate in the process of helping clients with BPD, then the repetition compulsions are a central, key, helpful aspect of how we do that work, how that gets processed and understood. And so, repetition compulsions in life and relationships with significant others are hurting the person with BPD more, but they're not in control of them. It's really subconscious, and it hurts, ends up being even abuse and trauma for loved ones around the person with BPD. So this is why I hope people with BPD, if they can relate, or if they've experienced at least those kind of times where people have said, why did you say this? Why did you do that? You were just screaming at me. And whether or not you understand that it's so important to get into treatment, into therapy, into working with someone, and someone who really knows, what this is really about, and won't just give you medication. And I'm sure there are lots of people out there who specialize in BPD who understand this, but I would say that there aren't people out there. I'm not trying to say, hey, I'm special, I'm the only one. No. But what I can offer clients with BPD is that I had BPD and I recovered from BPD. So I'm not just talking about a theory. I'm not just saying, well, it's like this because, and here's the explanation. I lived through it. I went through it. I had to grow through it. I had to learn, and it's painful and it's not easy, but it can be done when somebody skillfully helps you to reflect back, to work through the shame, to work through the humiliation, to work through the lack of understanding, to understand where it's really coming from, what it is, and why it keeps on getting triggered, and what that actually, why that happens. And so, how the repetition compulsion of reenacting all your trauma is coming from a subconscious, deep wounded place, a primal place that um, is all designed, okay, to help you resolve this. But that won't happen in interpersonal relationships at all, no matter the type, because of the brunt of it comes across as abusive and traumatizing to people who are close to you if you have BPD. And if you have BPD, you probably are aware that, these things happen and you're not sure why, and you're probably protecting and then thinking someone else did something to you and you didn't do that to them. And it's because you're not aware of what's really happening when you're triggered to emotional dysregulated and highly dissociative past trauma that you're going to dissociatively bring into the here and now and aim at somebody who isn't really the person that created the trauma in the first place. So I hope that was helpful in helping people with BPD or loved ones understand what I'm always talking about, and I'm sure you might have read other places, but what a repetition compulsion and borderline personality disorder actually is, what it means, what the ramifications and often the consequences are to loved ones in relation to people with BPD, and also how these repetition compulsions do not help do what they're actually designed for in a sort of protective, trying to resolve from a subconscious place this trauma, but how that can be really an effective, crucial, central place from which to start in a therapy and a recovery process, working with someone like myself or someone else. That's where the repetition compulsions can be begun to, you can begin to understand them. If you have BPD, you can begin to process them and work them through, find out where they're coming from, get the difference that what's happening, the splitting, the defense mechanisms, the flood of emotions, and that it doesn't belong in the here and now at all, and then what's happening to people around you as a result. So repetition compulsions in borderline personality disorder can be excellent avenues of treatment and helpful change and growth toward healing for those with BPD in therapy and in recovery processes, but do not work and do the opposite and increase suffering in borderline personality disorder for those with BPD in interpersonal relationships or in any relational dynamic in which this occurs, which people with BPD don't really have control over, and it's subconscious until they start to learn in a therapy process about it and then repair it, so it won't keep happening. And so that's another way that people can kind of gauge if you do have somebody with BPD in your life and they're getting therapy. Is this still really going on? Is this still happening? I mean, after, a certain amount of time, different for everyone. But if you don't start to see something changing or a little more awareness growing, then that's unfortunately a sign that the person might be going to therapy, but they're not engaging it, or they're not fully, committed to it. So anyway, borderline personality disorder and repetition compulsions, not targeted um, abuse or trauma to those around people with BPD the way that narcissists have a whole other thing going on. So I hope that was helpful in people with BPD understanding repetition compulsions and loved ones or ex-loved ones or people who are now have been abused, unfortunately, by this in the sense that it wasn't on purpose, but or have accrued too much trauma and can no longer be around somebody who hasn't been able to be helped yet or sought help to be able to understand what they're doing that is so hurtful to you and driving you away because they won't perceive it that way. It's a dissociative episode, subconsciously driven, and they'll think that you started it all and you did it and you said this and you said that. And a lot of that is yes, it's lack of personal responsibility taking. It's also based on the flood of emotions, the dissociative nature of reenacting of trauma, which is the repetition compulsions. But it's also just that this is so deep in people with PPD that if they don't go and engage serious therapy about it, they're not going to change it. And then unfortunately, people around them are going to be traumatized by it. So it's it ends up being abusive and traumatizing to people who are close to those with BPD who don't get help and get through this and change it. And it also increases the suffering of the person with BPD. And so it's just a no-win, lose-lose all around. And so that's why when people are engaging therapy, if you're in a relationship with somebody with BPD, or you have somebody with BPD in your life you still care about, but you need really to have harm reduction there. You need to have boundaries and you need to maybe go no contact. Maybe you need to leave a relationship because people with BPD, when all this is going on and they have no awareness, they don't understand why people distance and they feel abandonment. And it ends up that their trauma ends up traumatizing you if you're a loved one or a person close to them or who cares or cared about them until they make it to where subconsciously and not intentionally that you just can't take it anymore. And yet the person with BPD is kind of stuck with it until they engage therapy and gain the awareness, which many people do, but a whole lot more still need to, so that they can do this, resolve the issues that create all of these triggered, dysregulated emotions, dissociative episodes, and reenactments of trauma known as repetition compulsions. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. And take care of yourself, whether you have BPD or you're on the other side of somebody who does.